is the 2022 proposed water resource element guidance update. There's really two major sections that's new within the guidance. There are checklists as well as best practices related to two major areas. One is something that the previous water resource element guidance did focus on, but we are expanding that content and updating it. This is related to protecting water resources as the local land use plan is developed and also as it's built out over time to ensure that it's consistent with MDE's current water resources programs. And the second aspect is something brand new, which is integrating climate change considerations, especially flooding risks, into the various assessments that are already part of the water resource element guidance. Those assessments related to drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater. Also, we're making this, as you can tell, this is a web-based guidance now with many links to available resources at MDE, at DNR, and within planning that ideally are going to, and also EPA for that matter, to ideally facilitate the development of an updated water resource element. So on the slide 3, in terms of what's stayed the same, there are two major aspects of the water resource element guidelines from 2007 related to drinking water assessment and wastewater assessment. Those are still current and should be followed. And we have a couple links here. I know you can't click on the next slide, on slide 4. I think what we're trying to do here is and throughout the document is try to clarify what the expectations are. So we provided checklists in several locations of the guidance. One related to overarching general expectations, which is this one right here. And there's also expectations related to the climate change section and related to the identifying and protecting suitable waters section. Guidance is a description of best practices. So we're asking that local governments, as staff and or financial resources are available, to do this and implement the best practices listed in this guidance as well as possible. And if time or staff or financial resources are not available, then at least the water resource element can identify gaps in information, gaps in terms of necessary studies or analyses that need to happen, and resources that ideally can be addressed and filled before the next overarching comprehensive plan update. If there is resources available, we as a general expectation, expect that the necessary information analysis would begin before the comp plan update. And slide 5, the next slide, is we've listed a few technical assistance providers. Certainly at MDE and Matt's group is the Water and Science Administration. Within planning, we have the Resource Conservation and Management Unit, Chesapeake and Coastal Service, as well as the Maryland Geological Survey within DNR. And for the others, we've listed them. We're here to help you to connect to these other groups if you need their assistance, whether it's from Department of Agriculture, your local soil conservation districts and watershed groups, or any NGOs that may have information that can assist with implementing this guidance. The next slide starts talking about when you should update your water resource element. So we want to try to be clear about that because it's obviously it's a big undertaking, and we wanted to list several instances where updating the WRE really makes the most sense. And of course, since we're talking about climate change as one of the issues, we are hoping that you will update your water resource element if any kind of climate impacts to water resources are not currently considered. And even if climate change wasn't happening, we have this focus on flooding. So, and this is something brand new as well, is that in the previous guidance, we talked about stormwater quality impacts, but we're expanding that given climate change impacts, especially to flooding in Maryland. We're hoping that you will update your WRE if it does not consider, and we expect that most of them do not consider flood risks or identify local flood-prone watersheds, or if your local land use plan does not consider local flooding. So those are some examples of when to update your WRE. The next slide is other instances when you would when we would hope you would update your water resource element. One is just if you're putting forward a brand new and significantly different land use plan, whether it's increased densities or whether it's just expanded areas of development. Another is that if you are expecting to start using up a high percentage of your available water and sewer demand, as you implement your land use plan and you forecast ahead how much available wastewater capacity or water appropriation you would need, if you're expecting to exceed 80% of that, we're asking that you update your WRE. And lastly, with regard to your receiving waters, if there's brand new significant information, for example, if there's a brand new TMDL for one of your receiving waters, significant changes to water availability, monitoring data that shows declining quality of your receiving waters, et cetera, we're expecting an update to your water resource element.
So as Jason, just to recap a little bit, as Jason said, two of the big reasons we wanted to update, that we felt it necessary to update the WRE, was one, when the original guidance was developed back in 06, 07 timeframe, that was before the Bay TMDL. So a lot of our Bay cleanup, our framework back then, it was in a voluntary framework. We were still working under the tributary strategies. So it was a different time, a different approach to Bay restoration specifically. We did have other TMDLs that had been developed by that time too. But as far as Chesapeake Bay, we were still under that voluntary tributary strategies approach. So we thought that was a good reason to update the WRE guidance. And then the second reason, as Jason mentioned, was to include climate considerations. And if you look at some of the, if you look at the website and dig into some of the details, there in the statute in Maryland that actually creates the Climate Commission, that statute calls on all state agencies to include climate considerations, and it mentions specific things like sea level rise and extreme events, I think, and saltwater intrusion. You know, that statute that created the Climate Commission also requires state agencies to consider climate in their plans, programs. And so what we wanted to do, and what this slide is here, is we wanted to, in the guidance, really clarify what the regulatory, like the Clean Water Act framework is that MDE uses to manage pretty much all its waters now, that the Bay, falls under the TMDL. And thinking that if, helping local jurisdictions to get more familiar with that framework would help them also develop the WRE. So there's a lot of information on this slide, and I'm going to take some time to walk through it. But really, if you start in the white boxes at the top, the one that has like a bold outline around it that says develop water quality standards, that's where it all starts. So, back when the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972, states, tribes, jurisdictions were required to develop water quality standards. And we have those in regulation that really identify it designates the uses of different water bodies and establishes criteria that are necessary to support those uses, whether it's dissolved oxygen or, temperature standards for our trout streams, things like that. So it really all starts there, and that's in regulation. So being familiar with what standards apply in watersheds where you're planning growth and development is important to know. The water quality requirements that you're going to be held to in those watersheds. So that's where it all starts. And then in Maryland too, we have water quality monitoring programs where we look at whether those standards are being attained. And through those programs, we know we can identify waters that are not meeting those standards, as well as waters that are of higher quality, right, that are meeting or exceeding the standard. So through that water quality monitoring process, we come to an understanding of whether waters are impaired, and you may need a TMDL and have to go down a restoration pathway, if you will, to restore those water quality standards. And we also have a good sense of where water quality is higher, or even of exceptional water quality that we want to protect. So our monitoring programs kind of allow us to determine sort of what pathway you go down. So it's important for, I think, local governments to understand, if you're planning growth and development in an impaired watershed, what does that mean, and what's the restoration approach that the state uses? Or, if you're planning growth and development in an area that's of higher water quality and meeting those water quality standards, what does that mean, and how should you be approaching that? So, and that's really where, if you look down the right-hand side of this flow chart, that gets into the restoration framework. So, if your waters are impaired and, you're planning growth and development in those impaired watersheds, in MDE, we issue permits like MS4 permits and discharge permits in those watersheds. And that's one mechanism that we try to make sure that you're putting appropriate controls in to deal with pollutants of concern in those watersheds, but also facilitate water quality restoration, like through the restoration requirement for MS4s, where you're putting practices in place, best management practices to restore those watersheds. So kind of you use the WRE as a mechanism to assess, how are you doing with your permits? Are you in compliance, or are you under a consent order and really falling behind in your permit requirements? Or also look at your water quality programs that you have in those watersheds where planned growth and development is being anticipated. And with that information, you can determine whether, you're on a trajectory of, it looks like, we have adequate programs, and, we have compliance with our permit, and we're on a path to restoration here, so that, you can make a demonstration that with an additional growth and development, you think those programs will still be effective. But if you're looking at a situation where, you have an impaired watershed, you're in consultation with us, you understand that water quality trends are still declining, and that really through your permits and the programs you have in place, you're not seeing the kind of the restoration or the positive water quality trajectory you want to see in that watershed. That can be an indication in your water resources evaluation that maybe you need to do more in those watersheds. So if you're planning growth and development under that scenario, you may want to, go above and beyond what's required in your permit, for example, or whether that's, putting additional stormwater requirements in place or other control mechanisms to ensure that the growth and development that happens in that watershed isn't going to further exacerbate, the poor, your water quality challenges, if you will. So kind of through understanding the process, knowing the standards that apply, where you are, what the monitoring data says, what trajectory you're on, how you're doing with your permits, what local water programs you have in place, whether it's 319, you get 319 money, or you have watershed plans, or evaluate all your local planning, your watershed restoration planning efforts, and see where that gets you. And you can use that through the WRE again to determine if, with planned growth and development, you may need to do a little bit more to ensure that you're restoring water quality in those impaired areas. And it's really a similar process if you have higher water quality, right? So, if you're in a situation where you're planning growth and development in an area where it's a tier 2, that's what we refer to as our high quality waters, or, you're meeting standards, you're not impaired in that area. Again, when you're preparing your WRE, take a look at the water quality trajectory in those areas. Do you see that you're really holding the line, and, you're maintaining that higher water quality? Or, again, in and you can consult with us on that. Do we have data that's showing maybe we're seeing some degradation and there's no more assimilative capacity in those watersheds? That, again, that's going to give you a sense that you may want to consider additional controls or protections if you're planning growth and development in those kind of areas. So that's, and on the next slide here, there's this webinar. You can click on these links and it'll take you right to those sections where you can get description of where your standards are, what web resources we have to provide you that information. So all this stuff's hyperlinked here that I'm talking about, and you can get to those areas directly from this presentation. Use attainability analysis, I won't talk about so much, but if there is a process in the Clean Water Act, just to say that, if you can't meet the water quality standards in a given area, it's not achievable for, different reasons. There is a process by which you can lower the standards but you have to go through a public process but just to say that there is a mechanism there. Again, if you're planning growth and development in an area and it's not really feasible to restore for whatever reason, there is a way to kind of reevaluate those standards. So we do talk about that in the guidance, just so you're aware about that process. And then the last piece, like Jason mentioned before, we are with the integration of climate now into this guidance, very much interested in how flooding and even to some degree, if you're talking about water supply areas too, that this might be for a future guidance where we talk about drought conditions and water supply issues. A lot of what we're seeing now is local flooding concerns. So again, as you go about assessing your water resources, think about how flooding may also be impacting your ability to achieve the water quality goals and water quality standards, but also about how if you're planning growth and development in an area that may be prone to local flooding, where you're already aware there may be some issues, you want to really be thinking about how can you plan growth and development in such a way that you're not going to exacerbate flooding in downstream communities where you already know you're experiencing some local flood concerns. So, one thing that we encourage in this guidance is that you should as you're preparing your water resources element, determine if you have historical flooding problems in the areas where growth is being planned, and identify those in the WRE. Think about including maybe recommendations for additional quantity management and stormwater controls if you are planning development in flood-prone areas. That could include, again, managing more stormwater than Maryland standards require, or retrofitting in some areas if flooding problems are severe. You might have issues with conveyance, where you have undersized culverts and things like that you may want to look at, or maybe you don't have that information, but that it's a gap like we talked about earlier, and you really you want to identify those areas for more study to make sure that planned growth and development isn't really adding to or exacerbating local flood problems that you may already be seeing. So that's an important consideration. And then there's other tools we provide, and again, they're hyperlinked in here in the guidance. Really, the goal is, like Jason said earlier, really to make it web-based and give you access to these tools. So hopefully it's helpful. But we have best practices in there for using the sensitive areas element too, in conjunction with the water resources element, to ensure coordination between the two. Sensitive areas can be wetlands, things like that are more prone to flooding, and there's certainly overlap between sensitive areas elements and the water resources. So think about that and maybe the climate connections between those two areas as you're updating the WRE. And again, we have some additional language and tools that can help you with that. We also have best practice in there for assessing water hazard risks and accounting for climate change adaptation and different WRE analyses. So there's some kind of some prescriptive processes in there that you can follow to help you assess your water hazards and your climate risks and vulnerabilities. We also include an overview of the Federal Emergency Management Administration framework for hazard management planning that may be helpful to you as you again are considering flooding and vulnerabilities and flood risks in developing your WRE. We also provide examples of climate change risks to water resources, water infrastructure, and communities that you may find helpful in the guidance. And there's other tools for data and analysis and different strategy approaches and language that we provide that, again, is hopefully of assistance to you as you go about your updates here. One thing, too, that and there's not a lot on it because it's such a new area, but we know that equity considerations are, something that we're broadly concerned about nowadays. So, how do you use an equity lens as you're considering plan growth and development and what the impacts to water resources may be? So we just really provide some questions to think about, the tie-ins as you go about developing your water resources element, and that could be what water resource and related infrastructure impacts will plan growth and development have on disadvantaged communities downstream and or sharing the same water source in the event that you're having water appropriations and withdrawals as a result of new development. So, just keep that in mind as you go about your work. Do you have EJ communities? What kind of back to the prior discussion, will you maybe be exacerbating flooding concerns in downstream communities? And are they already, experiencing flooding problems and are vulnerable and at risk? Think of kind of bring that lens to your work as you're making your update. And, if planned growth and development is occurring in disadvantaged communities, think about how you can avoid and minimize and mitigate any water resource or infrastructure impacts that may, exacerbate or otherwise fail to address the continuing inequities in the communities of concern. So put that lens on or that frame as you're thinking about impacts to local communities. And really, this is where we are. We've been reaching out and trying to provide training to interested parties. I know we don't have like a formal outreach plan, if you will. It's a little bit more ad hoc and kind of as requested. I know I think it's later in April, we're going to be at the Maryland Planning Directors meeting and give an update there. And as we mentioned earlier at the top, we're recording these to hopefully kind of recycle them, these webinars, and put that on the web and make it a resource to other folks who reach out with questions or want guidance. And we're also working to train, and again, this will probably be more as we go, but to make sure that both staff within MDE and MDP are trained on reviewing these guidance documents as they come in. So as you submit drafts to us or want us to review, that we're giving you consistent feedback, providing consistent reviews. So we're working between the departments to make sure we're consistent in the feedback and reviews that we do and getting information back to you. And with that, I think we're ready for questions.
So any of the folks on the call, are you thinking about updating your water resource element as part of your comp plan update? Or you're on the fence about it, or what are your thoughts about it right now? I can, yes.
Okay. Yeah. So this is Worcester, and we are in the very initial stages of beginning to update our comprehensive plan. And we do plan to include an update of the water resources element as a part of that. Okay,
that's great. Yeah, that's great. Does Frederick County, Jeremy or Shannon, where are you in the process of updating your comp plan, and what are your thoughts about the WRE?
It's Don Dorsey with Frederick County. Just speaking on Frederick County, we're looking into reviewing our comp plan, and we're also looking at the WRE. with us looking at having a new MS4 permit coming down, we've got a lot of things a lot of moving parts that we're trying to get prepared for.
Got it. And Stephen, if we're in Cecil County, what are your thoughts about this comp plan update and your water resource element update?
So at this point, we are still doing our review. We did do the review of the water resource element, but we are waiting further clarification on whether we're going to go ahead and just do some updates or do a whole new chapter, and that's still a debate at this point.
Okay.
Other day-to-day stuff has taken a little precedence at this time.
Sure. Yep. Okay. And I know we have several municipalities represented on the call today. And I'll start with Middletown. Cindy, do you have any updates on how the comp plan approach is coming and thoughts about the WRE?
Yeah, we're just, we've been working on it. Our water and sewer committee has taken the lead right now. We're hoping to get it to the planning commission in April. There's a lot to update for us, and we're really trying to make our chapter much more user-friendly this time around, because back in 2010, we basically, because the new regulations were out, we basically were using a lot of what Frederick County had, kind of catered to our needs, but we're kind of redoing the whole thing. So it's taken a long time this year.
Got it. So you are doing a full WRE update, it sounds like.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, and any of the things you heard today, I mean, related to like flooding issues or, possible impacts from climate change, what are your thoughts about that, about adding any kind of strategies related to those issues?
Yeah, we can hear you. Mm-hmm.
We don't have flooding issues in Middletown, so I'm not sure. I think, we talk about that in our sensitive areas element. I'm not sure whether it's being addressed yet in the water resources element, but we'll certainly take a look at that.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah,
please.
I was just going to say definitely use that as an opportunity, because I know there's different things. Some of you may be aware that we have there's some legislation last year that required MDE to identify, basically update our stormwater standards, but also in that legislation, it required us to look at frequently flooded areas since 2000. So I know I think in PG County, I believe some folks had reached out, that there have been some communities that of concern where there's been like repeat flooding, and definitely, if you're experiencing something like that, if you can use the WRE or in the comp plan as a mechanism to identify those areas where appropriate, it could help. Also with resources, and again, if there's information gaps and you don't really have a good handle, or you need to do some watershed studies in those areas, we're required under the legislation to identify areas since 2000 that are frequently flooded. And if you're putting that and kind of bringing our attention through this, through the planning process, again, it's a way for us to understand where the resource needs may be, and maybe be able to, again, if there's monitoring or watershed studies or modeling that needs to be done. It's a good way to bring that to our attention, and maybe we can find ways to help.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I was thinking for a couple other towns that are on the call, I'm assuming you do experience more flooding, whether it's nuisance flooding or other flooding, like in Pocomoke City. I wasn't sure, Jeremy or Linda, what are your thoughts about trying to incorporate flooding and those kinds of issues into your comp plan, maybe within the water resource element?
Hi, sorry, this is Linda. Yeah, we're having a lot of wind, so I'm going in and out of connection where I live. I think Dawn is actually the best person to speak for us. I don't believe Jeremy's online today. Maybe he is. He's not able to talk. But Dawn or Jeremy would definitely be more knowledgeable than myself.
Okay.
Your FEMA plans, your local hazard mitigation plans, we did do some review of the local hazard mitigation plans to see where, so, and we referenced that in the WRE guidance. So there may be, that may be a resource to you that already identifies areas in that you can kind of refer to in the WRE where appropriate. My experience looking back at those local hazard mitigation plans is typically they just talk about like the areas that we're already familiar with, like the 100-year floodplain and sort of the regulated areas, if you will, and don't really talk about where there may be nuisance flooding or lot-to-lot flooding or sort of flooding, outside your typical waterways and 100-year floodplain. So, think about areas like that again influence with plan growth and development and kind of bringing those considerations into your plans.
Yeah, this is Don Dorsey again with Frederick County. I know we are updating our hazard mitigation plan as we speak, and we do have a lot more honed in areas that we're looking at. So we are kind of moving in that direction already, and that's where there's a lot of moving parts for at least Frederick County that we're, as things kind of come together, we'll be able to have a lot better information and kind of gather it up. But yeah, we're definitely, and we also know that there's the A storm, I believe, is kind of coming through the pipeline.
That's right.
So,
that's right.
We're kind of trying to make sure we get all of these elements together so that we don't, have to redo this in some ways.
Yeah, and if you're really doing a good overhaul in your local hazard mitigation plan, and you think that appropriately identifies the flood prone area, I mean, it can be as simple as just referring to that in the WR, that's where some of the updates are. But again, if you are planning growth and developments in those areas, specifically where you're experiencing some flooding, you may want to say more specifically about that in the WRE and how additional development won't, will not exacerbate those conditions essentially.
Yeah, and Don, one aspect of, we try to get into in the guidance is also the, other types of impacts, mainly from, increased precipitation, to your water infrastructure, your wastewater infrastructure and stormwater infrastructure. And there is this EPA website that we link to that provides a specific software tool for water utility or any kind of utility owner and operators, and it may be helpful for your hazard mitigation plan, but also for the WRE as a whole. And it's EPA has something called climate impacts on water utilities within their website, and they have a tool called Climate Resilience Evaluation and Awareness Tool. So it's specific to to water, not just drinking water utilities, but any kind of utilities, to get a sense of how climate change may create a risk and therefore should inform future investment decisions.
Yeah, Jason, I just wanted to, we'd identify that particularly storm flooding, is something that we're going to have to wrestle with pretty significantly over the next 10 years, between these microburst storms and active construction sites. And we have a lot of those issues going on right now. And we feel pretty confident that we have the information. It's, as Matthew just said, it's in the hazard mitigation plan, or it's in the nuisance flooding plan, or it's in the floodplain requirements. It's all together. So cobbling it together, we don't feel it's going to be an issue. But then the question is, what are the next steps? Mm-hmm. And it was our here, that A storm here. I know that our chief of plans review, he's part of Maryland Municipal Stormwater MAMSA, and there's potential for updated regulations in the next couple of years, all these other things. So that's our decision-making process is, do we just fill in the gaps and wait to see what happens, or do we go forward?
If you're really going to address local flooding issues, you have to take a comprehensive approach. if we update our design standards, to capture more rain, that's only with new development, right? That's only with new development coming in. That doesn't address the historical development in that watershed. I mean, your MS4 does through retrofitting, and we kind of get at it through some of that, through the restoration, the MS4 restoration requirement. But again, you may probably in a lot of these watersheds, to do it right, you're going to have to do a watershed study, and again, really what the whole system looks like, and where there's culverts, and whether they're undersized, and if you have conveyance, if you're having conveyance problems, or certain like bottlenecks or choke points within the stormwater or drainage system that are causing some of those local flooding issues. So it's really it's taking, I think the next step is, but again, where do you get, do you have the money to do those studies? How long is it going to take? And all, there's all the, a series of issues that go with it. But I think, identifying those watersheds, where those issues are, where you need the studies to be done, really to comprehensively address those issues. And again, that's where I was saying, if you can identify some of that as appropriate in updates, we may be able to work with a lot of federal funding, where maybe no pun intended, the funding floodgates are open now, where we can bring some resources to help you with those kind of assessments. But I think that's really, in a lot of cases, what needs to be done to really address those local flooding problems in a comprehensive way, because it's usually a number of factors that are contributing to those conditions.
I mean, based on what folks have heard, is there any particular information or assistance you might need from us to help you in your consideration of whether to update your WRE or just generally for updating your WRE if you've already decided to move forward with that? So, for example, Steve in Cecil County, I mean, is there any particular questions you might want us to help with? I know like you said, you're swamped with other day-to-day tasks, but anything you would want us to help with to help you with that decision?
No, unless you can figure out how to get a 37-hour workday going and
Oh boy.
try to get all those things going. Not this time, but we know that David and you are there, and we'll be able, like did our review, we'll probably tackle it piece by piece.
Got it. Okay. No problem. Yeah. So we are going to be providing these types of webinars, moving forward. But some things we're trying to figure out how to expand the content. So, we could, in addition to this type of just general overview, we could get into more details, for example, about the EPA website and tools that they have available. Maybe we could ask EPA to present on what those are. Or get to more details and other things like the A-Storm effort or anything else. Or we can have maybe examples from an existing comp plan or existing WRE that has addressed climate change issues to some extent. Maybe we can have that jurisdiction help with the presentation, for example. But we know it's kind of early in the process, but we're looking for your thoughts about how we can expand the content and help you. The issue that I guess, Stephen, that you brought up is one that we recognize as well, is just the need for staff assistance and financial or just time to actually make some of this type of work happen. So that's maybe something that I can talk with Matt and I can put our heads together again about other type of assistance that may be out there. I don't know if the U.S. Corps of Engineers could help with these types of analyses or not. They have much increased funding available because of the latest infrastructure law. So maybe we can put our heads together about that.
Yeah, there are opportunities with the Corps and those are typically, the Corps are usually, they have a program called Planning Assistance to States, and I guess that would apply to local governments as well. But that's a 50-50 cost share program where they can come in. And if to the point that we were talking about earlier, Steve, if you need like, if you're having local flooding issues and you want to model how, growth and development, how to do that in a way that won't exacerbate or find out what the bottlenecks are in the stormwater system that are contributing to flooding, it could be that the Corps can bring some modeling resources there to help with those kind of assessments. But those are typically, again, 50-50 cost share. So we hope to, provide some more of those resources too once we get more detail and what's applicable. Hopefully also provide some links to those resources on the web, or have the Corps come and talk about that at some local meetings, perhaps.
Yeah, another idea that Susan Lewis you put forward, which is a good one. It's just given that increased measures to prevent problems with water quality and water quantity management as flooding and precipitation increases, that requires more space on a property. So how does it impact the design of development as well? And that's an important issue as well in terms of those types of standards and the visions that a local government may have for redevelopment or new development, how that can be impacted over time. So another idea for expanded content that we may be able to get into. Okay. Yeah, thanks everybody for your time today. We're here if you have any questions, and we'll send some follow-up emails as we talked about today.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Have a good day.